The scream didn't just echo. It tore. This was a 10-year-old boy destroying himself against a wall. Eli Cole sat on the floor with his back pressed against the marble column, knees drawn up, both hands clamped over his ears. His head struck the stone behind him in a rhythm that made everyone flinch, for hard impacts, then a pause, then 4 more. Vivian Cole knelt 3 feet away in a Chanel suit worth more than most people's cars, and none of it mattered. Her son was drowning in front of her, and she couldn't reach him. Eli. Baby. Mommy's here. Her voice cracked on the last word. She'd been saying variations of the same thing for 40 minutes. Try the weighted vest again, Sandra said quietly. A young therapist stepped forward with what looked like a padded life jacket. Eli's screaming intensified before she got within arm's reach. His head struck the marble harder. A thin line of blood traced down his temple. Back up. Back up. Sandra's hand shot out. He's reading approach as threat. Noise-canceling headphones? Someone suggested. Made it worse. 20 minutes ago. The communication cards. He ripped them. Remember? How long? She asked. Sandra hesitated. He's been in this state for 41 minutes. His baseline for these episodes is usually. I know his baseline. I'm asking how long until he hurts himself badly enough that we have to sedate him. Vivian stood up. The movement drew every eye in the lobby, because suddenly she wasn't a mother anymore. She was the woman who'd bought 3 competitors last year and fired a CFO in the middle of an earnings call. Grief hardened into something sharper. I'm offering $750,000, she said, and her voice carried the way it did in boardrooms. Not loudly. Not dramatically. But clearly enough that it stopped conversations on the mezzanine level. Right now. Today. Anyone in this building who can help my son. The number hung in the air like a challenge. Nobody moved. At the edge of the crowd, near the service corridor where the maintenance carts were parked, Marcus Williams stopped his floor buffer. The machine's motor died with a low whine. He'd been working this lobby for 8 years, 8 to 4:30, Monday through Friday, the same schedule he'd kept since his daughter was 2 years old and his wife was still alive. He knew which elevator made a grinding sound on the way to the 14th floor. He knew which bathroom on 3 had a slow drain. He knew the exact spot where the morning sun hit the marble and made the whole lobby look like it was on fire. And he knew that rhythm. 4 beats. Pause. 4 beats. His hand went to his pocket, where a small blue toy car pressed against his thigh. It had been there for 7 years. He'd bought it for his daughter Maya when she was 3, back when they were still learning what her diagnosis meant, back when he'd spent entire nights on YouTube watching occupational therapy videos because the insurance wouldn't cover enough sessions. The car had ridges on the wheels. Maya used to run her thumb over them, back and forth, 4 times before stopping. 4 beats. Marcus stepped forward. He'd made it 3 steps before a hand clamped down on his arm. Curtis, the senior security guard, with 20 years on the job and a face that said he'd seen everything and trusted none of it. Marcus. Curtis's voice was low, not unkind. Think about what you're doing. Curtis didn't let go. His grip was the kind you earned after 20 years of watching people walk through glass doors with bad intentions. I know what I'm doing, Marcus said. Do you? Curtis's voice stayed low, but his eyes flicked toward the Cole family like they were a bomb with the casing cracked open. Marcus looked past him. Vivian Cole was still standing in the middle of the lobby, her offer hanging in the air like smoke nobody wanted to breathe. $750,000. The number should have started a stampede, but instead it had frozen everyone in place, because deep down they all understood the same thing: this wasn't a negotiation anymore. This was a woman watching her son break apart in real time, and no amount of money was going to fix what was happening inside that 10-year-old's head. Except maybe someone who'd seen it before. "I'm not asking for the money," Marcus said. Curtis blinked. The first crack in his stone face. "Then what are you doing?" Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out the small blue car. The paint was faded on one side where Maya had rubbed it against her cheek as a toddler. The wheels still had ridges. Curtis looked at the toy, then back at Marcus's face, and something shifted behind his eyes. Marcus didn't explain. He just waited. After a long moment, Curtis let go of his arm. 2 minutes, Curtis said. "And if this goes sideways, I'm telling them I tried to stop you." "Fair enough." Marcus walked toward the center of the lobby, and the crowd parted without anyone deciding to move. Dr. Sandra Price turned when she heard him approach. She was a woman who'd spent 2 decades in behavioral intervention, and her face had the exhausted sharpness of someone who'd already cycled through every protocol she knew. She looked at Marcus the way she'd look at a janitor who'd wandered into an operating room, not hostile, just categorically irrelevant. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I need 2 minutes with the boy." The words landed flat. Sandra's expression didn't change, but her posture did, shoulders squaring, chin tilting up, the automatic response of a professional being challenged in her domain. "Do you have any qualifications in behavioral intervention?" "No." "Any training in de-escalation techniques?" "No." "Then I'm going to have to ask you to step back. This is a specialized medical situation." Marcus met her eyes. He didn't argue. He didn't list credentials he didn't have. He just said, "I only need 2 minutes," and something in the way he said it made Sandra pause, not because it was persuasive, but because it wasn't. There was no desperation in his voice. No pitch. Just a man stating a fact he'd already accepted as true. "He's been at this for 42 minutes, Marcus continued. His heart rate's elevated. He's dehydrated. In another 10 minutes, his body's going to start shutting down whether he wants it to or not. You can sedate him. You've got the kid in that bag," he glanced at the medical case near Sandra's feet, "but you don't want to use it. Because you know it'll take him 3 days to recover from the chemical hangover, and he's got enough on his plate." Sandra's mouth opened, then closed. "How do you know what's in that bag?" Marcus didn't answer. He was already looking past her, toward Vivian Cole. The woman who turned wasn't the CEO who'd bought 3 competitors last year. It wasn't the woman who'd fired a CFO mid-sentence on an earnings call. The silence didn't fall. It crashed. 1 second the lobby was a pressure cooker of noise, Eli's raw-throated screaming, Sandra's clipped commands, Vivian's jagged breathing, the shuffle of security guards who didn't know where to put their hands. The next second, everything stopped. Not because anyone asked. Because Eli stopped. The boy's head came away from the marble column. His hands dropped from his ears. And for the first time in 43 minutes, he was looking at something. Not through it. Not past it. At it. Marcus. The kid's eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, his face blotchy from crying, but there was something else underneath the exhaustion now. Recognition. The kind that didn't make logical sense because these two had never met, but Eli was staring at Marcus like he'd been waiting for him to show up. A 10-year-old in full sensory meltdown didn't just stop. The protocol said escalation, then exhaustion, then sedation. They didn't say anything about a janitor walking into the center of the room and the whole equation rewriting itself. Marcus hadn't stopped tapping. His fingers moved against his thigh in that same slow rhythm, 1, 2, 3, pause, 1, 2, 3, and Eli's shoulders, which had been hunched up around his ears like a turtle trying to retreat into a shell that didn't exist, started to drop. Half an inch. Then an inch. Then his whole posture shifted, his spine uncurling, his breathing slowing from ragged gasps into something that almost resembled a normal inhale. A man who wasn't doing anything except standing there, tapping his leg, and somehow speaking a language the boy understood better than words. Then Marcus raised his hand. Marcus pointed at the ceiling. Not dramatically. Just a single finger aimed at the fluorescent light panel third from the left column, the one that had been flickering for weeks with a frequency almost invisible to the naked eye. Almost. That light, Marcus said, and his voice was still the same low rumble, the kind you felt in your chest before you heard it in your ears. It's been doing that for 2 weeks. I put in a work order on the 12th. Maintenance closed it without checking because the bulb still turns on, and to them, that means it works. He paused. Eli's breathing hitched once, then steadied. But it doesn't work. Not for someone who can see 60 cycles per second instead of 50. To him, that light isn't flickering. It's strobing. Every second he's under it is like someone's pointing a camera flash straight into his brain and pulling the trigger over and over and over again. Sandra's mouth opened. No sound came out. She looked at the light, then at Eli, then back at the light, and something in her expression cracked, not her professional composure, that was still intact, but something underneath it. The part of her that had spent 40 minutes running through every intervention she knew and coming up empty. Marcus didn't look at her. He was still watching Eli, still tapping that same rhythm, and when he spoke again his voice was quieter, meant only for the boy even though everyone could hear. He's not melting down because of the crowd. He's not melting down because of the noise. He's been trying to tell you that for 40 minutes. Marcus gestured toward the column Eli had been pressed against, toward the spot on the marble where the boy had been beating his own head. Every time he pointed up, you thought he was gesturing randomly. When he opened his hand, palm up, the object resting there was a toy car. He set it down on the marble floor between himself and Eli, placing it with the care of someone handling evidence or scripture or the last photograph of someone who wasn't coming back. This was Noah's, Marcus said, and his voice wasn't the low rumble from before. It was something quieter now, something that sounded like it had been sanded down by years of saying things that hurt too much to say out loud. My son. He couldn't use words either. Not the way most people mean them. He would tap his fingers on the wall when the world got too loud, same rhythm, over and over, and I spent 12 years learning what every tap meant. 12 years. Not from any book. Not from any specialist. From him. From sitting next to him at 3 in the morning when the streetlight outside his window was flickering at a frequency nobody else could see and he was pressing his palms against his ears and screaming without making a sound. The accident happened 6 years ago, Marcus continued. Noah was 14. A driver ran a red light on 7th Avenue, and just like that, the only person who ever taught me how to listen was gone. I carry this car every day. Not to remember him. I don't need a toy to remember my son. I carry it because it reminds me that there are signals in this world that can only be heard by a heart that's already been broken open. That some frequencies don't exist in any diagnostic manual or treatment protocol. They exist in the space between what someone is showing you and what they're trying to survive. Eli's hand moved. It was the first voluntary movement he'd made in 40 minutes that wasn't self-protective, wasn't defensive, wasn't trying to block out a world that had become a weapon against his nervous system. His fingers closed around the little blue car, and he held it in his palm the way you hold a live bird, gentle and terrified at the same time. Then, without looking up, without making eye contact with anyone, he turned the car over and ran the bent wheel across the marble floor. Back and forth. Back and forth. A tiny clicking sound, plastic on stone, so quiet it was almost invisible. Vivian Cole grabbed Claire's shoulder, her knuckles going white against the fabric of her assistant's blouse, and for the first time since she'd built an empire out of steel and spreadsheets and the fear of her competitors, she looked like she might collapse. Not from shock. From recognition. From the sudden, unbearable weight of understanding that her grandson had been speaking a language this whole time, and she had been the one who didn't know how to listen. Sandra stood frozen 3 feet away, her professional training reduced to nothing by a janitor and a broken matchbox car and 12 years of fatherhood that cost nothing and meant everything. Marcus nodded toward the ceiling without breaking his rhythm, and Curtis, who had been watching the whole thing unfold with his hand still resting on his radio, understood what needed to happen before anyone said a word. He keyed his mic and called for maintenance. Not the regular crew. Someone who could climb a ladder and remove a fluorescent bulb that had been flickering at 60 cycles per second for 2 weeks, driving a 10-year-old boy slowly out of his mind while everyone around him tried to fix the wrong problem. $750,000. The number was printed in black ink that seemed to absorb the light from the chandeliers overhead, and Vivian Cole's signature sat at the bottom of it like a confession she couldn't take back. Vivian stood frozen 3 feet from where Marcus was still crouched on the floor with Eli. The boy had stopped tapping the car against the stone. He was holding it now, just holding it, his small fingers wrapped around the blue metal like it was the first thing in years that had made sense to him, and his breathing had slowed to something almost human. Vivian's hand shook when she took the check from Claire. Not the theatrical tremor of someone performing remorse for an audience. This was the real thing, the kind of shaking that came from somewhere deeper than muscle memory, from the place where a 67-year-old woman who had built an empire out of willpower and intimidation was suddenly forced to confront the possibility that she had been wrong about everything that mattered. She held the check out toward Marcus, and the paper trembled in the space between them. Marcus didn't take it. He looked down at Eli instead. Marcus watched his son for 3 full seconds, and in those 3 seconds, you could see him doing math that had nothing to do with money. "I don't need this for myself," he said, and his voice was quiet but it carried the way a stone carries when you drop it into still water. He looked up at Vivian, and there was no anger in his face. No triumph either. Just the exhausted clarity of a man who had been carrying something heavy for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to put it down. "But I know what it can do." He didn't reach for the check. "I want to build a center. Not a clinic. Not a hospital. A center. A place where parents like me, parents who've spent years learning how to listen to kids that the world doesn't know how to hear, can teach other families what we've learned. No degrees on the wall. No diagnostic manuals. Just people who've been through it, sitting down on the floor with families who just got a diagnosis and don't know what to do next. Because the expertise isn't in the chairs. It's in the people sitting in them. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that happens when an idea is too big to fit through the door all at once. Someone in the back of the crowd let out a breath they'd been holding since Marcus first knelt down 40 minutes ago. Claire's hand went to her mouth. Vivian's face did something complicated, something that looked like grief and hope and shame all wrestling for control of the same set of muscles. And then Sandra Price stepped forward. She had been standing at the edge of the crowd this whole time, Dr. Sandra Price, Ph.D. in clinical psychology, 20 years of experience, published in journals that most people couldn't spell, the woman who had been shouting about protocols and restraints and sedation when this whole thing started. She took off her glasses and folded them carefully, the way you fold something you don't need anymore, and when she spoke, her voice was raw in a way that suggested she'd been crying without making any sound. "I was wrong." She said it like she was saying it for the first time in her entire career, and maybe she was. "I've spent 2 decades studying psychology. I've read every paper, every study, every treatment protocol. The Noah Williams Center opened on a Saturday morning in late October, 12 blocks from Cole Enterprises but a universe away from its marble lobbies and chandeliers. The building was red brick, 2 stories, the sign above the door was wood, not metal, hand-carved by a man in the neighborhood who had been doing cabinetry for 40 years and who refused to charge Marcus full price once he heard what the center was for. It read Noah Williams Center in letters that you could feel if you ran your fingers across them, and underneath, smaller, the words "Every parent in this building knows what it means to listen." Inside, there were no desks. No reception counter. No framed degrees on the walls, no motivational posters, no corporate branding anywhere. The front room had been converted into a circle of armchairs, all of them second-hand, none of them matching, each one worn in different places from different bodies over different decades. The doors opened at 9, and by 9:15 the armchairs were full. Not with donors or journalists or city officials. With parents. Black parents, mostly, but not all. Single mothers in scrubs who had just gotten off night shifts. A father in a paint-spattered work jacket who kept his hand on his son's shoulder like he was afraid the boy might float away if he let go. A grandmother who had been raising her nonverbal granddaughter for 7 years and had never once spoken to another adult who understood what that meant until she walked through the door and saw the circle of chairs and started crying before she even sat down. Dr. Sandra Price arrived at 10. She came alone, wearing jeans and a sweater, no blazer, no briefcase, no credentials anywhere on her person. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the room, at the circle, at the parents who were already talking in low voices about IEP meetings and meltdown triggers and the particular exhaustion of loving a child the world kept trying to fix instead of understand. Then she walked to an empty chair, sat down, and didn't say a word for the next 2 hours. She just listened. A mother named Keisha talked about the first time her son banged his hand against the wall and how she had stood in the hallway afterward and pressed her own hand against the same spot and tried to feel what he felt. Sandra's eyes never left Keisha's face. She didn't take notes. She didn't analyze. She didn't offer a single piece of clinical advice. When the session ended, she found Marcus near the coffee table, and she said, her voice rough, "I've been doing this wrong for 20 years. Marcus looked at her, and he didn't say "I told you so." He just nodded and handed her a cup of coffee in a paper cup. 6 weeks after the opening, Vivian Cole walked through the door. She came alone, no assistant, no driver waiting outside, wearing a coat that probably cost more than the building's monthly rent and looking like a woman who had spent her entire life walking into rooms where she was the most powerful person by default and had no idea what to do in a room where that wasn't true. Eli was with her, his hand in hers, his eyes fixed on the floor in front of his feet. He was wearing the blue car in his jacket pocket.